Thank you everyone for joining. So this session, I think we've got 15 minutes, is about equity crowdfunding. If you have any questions, just pop them either in the chat or in the questions tab. The chat is just for this room, so feel free to just chat. But maybe just ask questions in there. And if it's one where you want to come on stage, click request to join and say that in the chat as well. But I might just quickly get started. As we would here in New Zealand. I'm in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kia koto, no otipoti ho, ko ana toko ingoa, na mihi nui kia koto. I just introduced myself in Te Reo Māori and said that I come from Dunedin. I am the founder of Pledge Me, which is an equity crowdfunding platform. We were the first licensed equity crowdfunding platform in New Zealand and one of the first in Australia. And unfortunately, we're the only one, potentially in the world, run by a woman. I'm not actually running the platform anymore, but it was me for a while, and now we have a new CEO in Dr. Claire McGowan. So this session is really just to explain a little bit about what equity crowdfunding is, give you some tips, and answer your questions. So equity crowdfunding, for those of you that don't know what it is as simple as it sounds. You go out to your crowd for funding, but instead of offering rewards, which is what you'd normally see in the crowdfunding space, your album, your book, something that you've made, you offer shares in your company. And this is really cool because historically, if you wanted to go out to the public and offer shares in your company, you'd have to create this thing called a prospectus or a public disclosure statement or something that is typically very, very expensive because it costs a lot of time with lawyers and accountants and things like that. And equity crowdfunding makes it a lot less expensive, hopefully. And you can just go out to the public under new regulations. There are some rules around it. You're not allowed to be false and misleading, and then some very specific rules in Australia. But it does mean that anyone could invest relatively easily without having to go through a public disclosure statement process or listing on a stock exchange. So earlier stage companies can do it. And it's been really powerful for women. We've seen that 60% of our successful campaigns were run by female founders. And when you think that only 3% of venture capital goes to female founders, it's a really great and empowering statistic. And what I was saying in the chat earlier is we think that this is potentially because women are often taught to be really good at building community and building relationships. And so going out and activating their crowd while being very scary, we've seen women being very successful at that. So I'm going to quickly tell you the top 3 C's of a crowdfunding campaign. But to answer Vera's question first, what we normally see, the average raise through an equity crowdfunding campaign is $700,000, though we've seen everything from a $40,000 campaign through to a $4 million campaign. The average percent of the company that people give up, we recommend, especially in the first round, not selling more than 20% of your company. That means you can still pass special resolutions and ordinary resolutions within your founding group. So the top 3 C's, but do people ask questions? Just in the chat or in the questions tab, go for gold. But the top 3 C's to a great equity crowdfunding campaign. The first one is a good company. A good company, I don't mean by this that you're making a huge profit or anything like that, but a good company to us is someone who really understands their business. They know how it works. They know what money they need to grow. They might not quite know how they're going to get there yet, but they really understand their business. One example of this is a company that we had here in Christchurch called Atique, a solid shampoo bar business. And Brianne led the way on social enterprise here in New Zealand. But this is back when she first started and no one knew her. She was really clear of what she needed to raise to grow. And she was very clear about where she wanted to go, which international markets, what trends, and the structure of her business. She gave away 5% of, I think it's 5% of revenue or 20% of profit every year to charities just as part of doing business. So very good company, and she really knew what she needed to grow. The second C is a good crowd. So you know who loves you and loves what you do, either because they're purchasing your product or because you already have existing networks. And one example of this that we had was a vegan cheese company called Angel Food. And vegans are very passionate people. And so when Alice from Angel Food went out to her crowd, the people who loved her cheese invested almost immediately. She raised $200,000 in 2 weeks to grow her vegan food company. She also had someone who changed their name to Vegan for Life as part of the process. And the third C is good comms. So being able to communicate what you do. You can have a great company and great crowd, but if they don't know who you are and what you're doing, they're not going to get on board. And so one example of this that we had was for a company called Ocho, where they are a chocolate making company, and they wanted to keep chocolate making skills in their town after the biggest chocolate company there, Cadbury's, closed their factory. And so they went out to their community and asked them to pre-pledge. They had over $5 million pre-pledged before they went live, raised $2 million in 32 hours. So they really communicated what they were doing and why, and got people on board. So Linda, I have a new system that can offer an ROI, but not in the form of shares. It's a new economic model, a new system that doesn't fit into the current models of business operation, but does have the potential to make long-term returns for those, just not through shares. Is there a question in that, Linda, just around what you're doing with offering returns, financial returns? It is a very complicated space with legislation. We've overcomplicated it. It shouldn't be as complicated as it is. But there's definitely some things to think about in that if you are offering financial returns, but I'm happy to have a conversation with you about that. And then your other question was around building your crowd. Building your crowd is something that I think often we do naturally without realizing that we're doing it. So for us, we talk a lot about your first 50. Who are the first 50 people that you think will pledge to your campaign? And typically, it's everything from family, friends, business acquaintances, customers are really important. We get people to think about mapping out that crowd that you already have, and then figuring out how you want to add value and connect with the crowd that you don't have yet. So who are the people that might be interested in what you're doing? And how do you connect with them now before you need something? Like, how do you build those relationships and networks so when you go out with an ask, they already know you? And how do you build out that ask in a way that makes people feel like they're part of it? It's not just a one-way street. One thing that I didn't say earlier about Good Company, so Atik, the solid shampoo bar business, in their first raise, they were quite small. I think she'd done $100,000 in revenue. She raised $200,000 through our platform on a pre-money valuation. So valuation of the company, I think at the time was like $1 million. So she sold maybe 15% of her company to her crowd post-raise. She actually sold her company recently, completely. And the people that invested in that first round had over 48 times return on their investment. So she went in, people invested really early before they knew where she was going, but they were there for the ride. And they really loved the product, they loved her, but then they actually made a return that in a lot of worlds is unheard of. So it can be a really exciting model for investors as well, getting in at that early stage. So Linda, you said equity crowdfunding, can it still be considered for your business? I think so. From a structural perspective in Australia, you need to be set up as a proprietary company or a public unlisted company. But if you're set up like that and you're not doing over $25 million in revenue or have more than $25 million worth of assets, and you have at least 2 directors, you can add one for doing an equity campaign, and at least one of them is resident in Australia, you are allowed to raise. The only thing is you're not allowed to raise if you're planning on using that money to invest in other things. So it has to be investing in the growth of your business. Yeah, so there's some great examples to Moira's point around different female-founded businesses that have gone out and raised through equity crowdfunding. And what we're seeing also in New Zealand, there's Indigenous-founded businesses as well. So people that might traditionally be excluded from the financial markets, we're seeing that they are really thriving in this space. Food Connect Shed is an example in Australia that we worked with, which someone mentioned earlier. They raised the money to buy their warehouse. They thought the infrastructure that they were using should be owned by the public. So they raised $2.1 million from their crowd. We also had a beautiful campaign for a company called How Now, which is an ethical dairy company. They never remove the calves from their mothers. So they think because of that, cows are happier. And the milk tastes better. So Vera asks, could you share the logistics of equity returns from the company after the crowd is invested? How do you pay back the investors? So Vera, typically you don't pay back the investors. You would only, if the company was sold, then they would receive money from that transaction. Also, if they're paying out dividends, then they could do that as well. The logistics of that really depends on the setup of the company. Sometimes they choose to use an external provider to do that process. But typically they're early stage companies, so they wouldn't be paying out dividends in the first few years anyways. So Jackie, you're new to this model, so just checking, would it be accurate to understand the individuals in initial crowd as a kind of micro angel investors? Yeah, it definitely is. So it's angel investors. But angel investors typically are people that don't know you. So this is, yeah, it's like angel investors. It's that early stage company, but typically what we see is it's people that do know you investing. And often what we see, and this angel investors say this as well, it's people are adding money into your business, investing and getting shares, but they're also adding other things. So we often see that people invest through equity crowdfunding can support in different ways, either because they're accountants or lawyers or with different skills. With Atik, 3 of their investors were chemists. And so when she was having trouble doubling her batching, one of them came in and solved her problem for her. Megan asked, what does the average person that supports a crowd equity campaign invest? So the average investment through into an equity crowdfunded campaign is $2,000, which is quite different from a traditional sort of product rewards campaign, like a Kickstarter, which is around $70. So people are investing or putting more money into companies than they might into project campaigns. And I said earlier, you may have heard, Megan, the average raise is around $700,000. So a bit higher as well. If I was starting out more, great question. What would you do first? So starting to raise the funds, I would probably sit down or I have done this actually, because we've raised for ourselves 3 times through our own platform. So we've equity crowdfunding. So the first thing that we've done every time is sit down and make a plan. What is it that we're raising the investment for, and why do we think people will be interested in that? And sort of really scope out the business plan around why we're raising now, what it's for, how much we want to raise, and then using that as a document to really figure out with our team how to prepare. From that document, you then figure out what the key messaging is for a pitch video, and you start briefing your designer to make it into something beautiful. So this can be called a business plan, it can be called an offer document, it can be called an information memorandum, but it's starting to think about, like, what are the main and core things that we really want to raise this money for, and how do we want to communicate that out to our crowd? Often people think that they should invest for everything, raise money for everything. But sometimes it's just really one core thing that you really want to do next. Enter the Australian market, develop a new product, and just really, really bring that back to like what that next step is in your business plan, not everything forever. Pierre Lynn, is there a secondary market for equity crowdfunding? Say if an investor wants out, can she sell her shares back to the company or somebody else? So there are some unlisted secondary markets that people can use, specifically here in New Zealand. Also, you can create a process to match willing buyers and willing sellers of the shares. Typically, we don't see people going on like a listed secondary market because then you'd have continuous disclosures, which is really hard for early stage companies to do. But yeah, there are definitely some unlisted markets that we've seen people use, and there's also the ability for a company to keep that list of willing buyers and willing sellers. And what we've seen is people coming into this need to know that it's a risky investment. So the legislation in both countries says you have to say that up front, that the risk warning statement has to be shown multiple times to investors so they know that they might not get their money back. And so typically as well, it is a longer term investment. They're not just investing like they would on the stock exchange and maybe wanting to sell really quickly. Like this is a longer term investment, but hopefully also a better return. So, Monica, thank you. My lipstick is a very good Australian brand of lipstick. So, any other questions? If not, I might just tell another story. So, yeah, we've got 2 minutes left. one of my favorite campaigns, one of the only ones that has made me cry, was for a company here in New Zealand, an Indigenous company based just outside of Gisborne on the East Coast, an area that has the highest rate of Indigenous people, the highest rate of unemployment, and the highest rate of youth suicide. And so they decided as an organization that they wanted to create a company that could provide hope for their young people. And they decided to go out and set up a medical cannabis company to do this because they were sort of like, well, they're potentially already growing this, so maybe we could hire the kids to work for us in a legal sense. And they managed to go out and activate their community. They went to all the local marais, to the local meeting houses of the Indigenous tribe. They went out and talked about what they were doing. They created processes so people that didn't have computers could pledge to their campaign. We created paper pledging packs, which I was originally a little bit against, but like it totally makes sense to make this more accessible for their community. And they had people pledging $50 to this campaign. So it wasn't a lot of money, but they managed to raise $2 million in 10 minutes of going to the public. So this was a few years back. It actually broke our platform twice, but it was just this powerful engagement of their crowd who didn't really know how this company was going to happen, but they really wanted to be a part of it. So that was just a quick story I wanted to tell you. I think our time is potentially about to run out, but thank you so much for joining us. And if you'd like to ask any questions, I'm best to get on Twitter.